What's up, gangsters? It is time for another talking head video. So, if you are in that number of people who think that's automatically useless, stop now. This video has a real specific purpose and a real specific audience, mostly members of the Scale Modelers Critique Group. So, if you are not a member of that group and don't care to discuss the subject of critique, which is what this video is going to be about, then also stop now. This is not relevant to your interests. But the reason that I'm doing this is because if you're a member of the group, you know that even though it's in the name and we do spend a lot of time on critique, I suppose, it's not the only thing that we do. We have lots of work in process, lots of reference photo posts, lots of, various other things besides just purely critique, which people seem to think is purely about work that's already finished. I actually feel like critique that happens during work in process is a lot more useful. But point being is that it's not the only thing we do, but it is a very important part of what we do within the group. And I was probably witnessed, maybe embarrassingly so, on a couple of occasions over the last 6 months, to be a little cranky about some critique that was given to, and I'm going to put this in quotes, critique, and yeah, that'll make sense here in a minute, that was given, by and to some of our members, me included. And so I thought, well, okay, if I'm not really satisfied with the quality of the critique that's taking place, what can I do to actually help make it better as opposed to just being a smartass about it? That unfortunately comes too easily. So that's why I'm making this video. I want to talk about the nature of critique and what makes good critique. So, because I do believe that giving good critique is a skill. I really kind of hate the phrase constructive criticism because I feel like that puts the entire onus on the speaker rather than the listener. And I really strongly feel like that in most cases that it's up to the listener to decide what to do with critique, and therefore to either make it constructive or not. Because look, the reality is that no matter how hard you try, you're never going to be able to say something in exactly the right way to make every single person happy. And that's especially true with something that's as sensitive as offering feedback on someone's work, especially work that they've poured themselves into and that they, at least ostensibly did for fun. So, I want to say up front that I generally hate the term constructive criticism, but going back to what I said, giving good critique is a social skill. And how you say it and what you say is important. So I don't want to minimize that. I feel like that even if somebody says, yeah, that looks like shit, well, that's not particularly good critique, but yeah, you still as the listener have the choice about how to take that on board and deal with it. But nonetheless, there is good and bad critique, and that's what I want to try to address here. So I feel like that it's kind of important to basically consider critique in two different categories. Subjective and objective. Now, I'm going to start with objective because I feel like that's the easiest. And in my definition, and I want anybody to feel free to disagree with me on any of this in the comments or whatever, but I feel like objective critique is the easiest thing because that's the stuff that addresses things that are objectively addressable. It's the stuff that there really is no debate about. It's the stuff that is either there or not there. It either is or it is not. For example, if somebody says, hey, it looks like you've still got a seam showing in front of the windscreen. or man, it looks like your paint's kind of rough. Well, that's pretty objective critique. You can see it in the photograph. It's either there or it's not. And I feel like that stuff is pretty easy. And it's important because I think that a lot of us maybe don't see stuff like that. I know that a lot of model makers are not operating with an optivisor. I know that I personally see a whole different world when I put on my number 2 reading glasses as opposed to my number 1 reading glasses, and that I do a lot of work with an optivisor. So I feel like I see just about everything, but I miss stuff. So I think that sometimes it happens that people just don't see things, and so objective critique is really valuable. They may not realize that they have texture in their paint and that maybe changing the way that they spray could make things look better. It's also true that a lot of times things just don't show up until you take a close-up photo and post it on Facebook for everyone to see. So I feel like objective critique is really important, and we try to emphasize a lot of that in SMCG. But I think it's important to make 2 points about objective critique. One is that even if it's a fact, that it's still there. Even if you can look at a photograph and say that there's a fingerprint, well, it's still your opinion about whether or not it should be fixed. The fact is that the person who did it just may not care. They can't see it, doesn't bother them, no big deal. They're just going to stick the thing up on the shelf and not think about it anymore. So it may not be an issue for them. So I think it's still important to couch those things in the right terms. And I think most people understand that obviously it's just rude to say, hey, shithead, you left a fingerprint on your wing. I mean, that's not cool. The only time that even sort of flies is if you really know that person and you're buddies, and busting each other's balls is part of your friendship and the way that you show love. And some dudes do that. And that can be a little bit of a challenge, especially in a group like SMCG that's really social, where you have a couple of members who may know each other pretty well, and they may in fact bust each other's balls like that. And somebody who doesn't know the group dynamic reads that and thinks that somebody's just being an asshole. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, but it is what it is. The other thing about objective critique is that there's a place where objective can definitely get blurred into the second category, subjective critique. And the place where I see that happen most often is with regard to color. There are more arguments, I think, on the internet about color, maybe than anything. And you guys have all seen them. You know what I'm talking about. That's not the right color for German Panzer Gray. Or, one that I've frequently participated in, which is, what color is U.S. Army Air Force interior green? Other than not the color sold by MRP. Anyway, those things can be, I think, classified pretty easily into the objective category, right? I mean, if somebody tells you that the insides of the gear doors on a Mustang weren't ever painted, well, that's pretty much an objective fact. That's pretty much historically verifiable. And so, again, that's objective, but it's also someone's opinion about whether or not it really matters. And this is where the color thing becomes very much more subjective, especially when you consider the fact that it is pretty difficult to not only establish the exact color of something from 70-year-old photographs, but you have to sort of factor in the thing about it being about a model of that subject being a snapshot. You're picking a moment in time and you're interpreting what you think the right color should be, and so that obviously is always going to be a bit subjective. I mean, you may have been to every museum in the world, and you may think that Panzer Gray is a certain color, but That doesn't mean that every Panzer had that exact batch of paint, had that exact, was sprayed in the exact same way, in the exact same factory, under the exact same conditions, blah, 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 on and on and on. And so that's where something like that can really become subjective critique. And I think this is where we have to be really careful. Because obviously, if you pipe up and say, well, that's just the wrong color, you're stating something that's really subjective as if it were objective. And this is where people tend to get sideways, because you've offered your opinion as a statement of fact, when in fact, it's not necessarily a fact. And we all know that that's what sets people off in a hurry. And then you have these long, drawn-out nerd fights about what color Panzer Gray really was, or whether or not the crew chief really would have. And we all know how those things can go. But in general, I think subjective critique is pretty easy to identify as well. Obviously, if somebody just comes along and says, well, that looks like a bag of assholes, well, that's pretty subjective. And also not very nice, so not very useful. If somebody says, well, that looks like a bag of assholes because, and they at least offer some more substantial additions to that, then it might be useful. It might be worth taking on board. The one that personally gets me is something that I see a lot. Sorry about the fly. It's fly season. They're driving us all crazy. There's nothing I can do. Anyway, the thing the one that gets me, that I see a lot on things like dioramas and with regard to weathering, is the subjective bit of critique that falls into the specific category of it needs. And you guys know what I'm talking about. It needs more rust, or it needs less rust. It needs more chips, or it needs less chips. Or like some that I got on a little diorama or vignette or whatever you want to call it that I did of a little tractor inside of a shop. I had all kinds of comments like, well, it needs a this on the workbench, or it needs a that over there in the corner by the fuel drum, or whatever. And those can be a little bit frustrating because I feel like that's a projection of what you imagine the thing should look like onto the person who's building it. And the bottom line is, you don't really know what they're thinking. You don't really know what their intent is when they build it. And that's important. Because while every tractor workshop in your experience may have a grease gun on the workbench, well, that doesn't mean that every workshop I've been in had one, or that I care about grease guns being on the workbench, or that I knew how to build one, or that I wanted to take the time to build one. So I think that it's important to be careful with commentary like that, because while the intent is undoubtedly good, and in those situations people are, I think, obviously giving feedback that they feel would contribute to the authenticity or the realism or whatever you want to call it of the thing, it is still sort of projecting what your intent would be if it was your project onto the person whose project it actually is. And so I think this is where subjective critique can really become the most challenging thing, because honestly, I mean, it's where a little bit more diplomacy is required. Because, yeah, sure, it's not that your input is invalid. It's not that it's not something worth considering, because the fact is that maybe the person who built the thing never even considered that. Or maybe they didn't know that Shermans had baked on paint and didn't maybe chip the same way that other kinds of tanks did. Or that, chips sort of have a certain shape and a distribution and a pattern and all of those things. Maybe they just haven't really thought about things on that level. So I think it's really important to focus critique on what's actually there and how the person may improve the thing that they actually did. But that's not to say that it's unimportant to suggest things that could go beyond what is actually there. Because that's how we grow, right? And again, we may not have ever even thought of that thing that's being suggested. But I just want to try and emphasize that that's where a little bit more diplomacy is in order. Because, again, you really are getting into your opinion at that point. And so if you just say, yeah, it needs more dents, well, yeah, okay, that's cool. When you do yours, you can put more dents in it, but I don't necessarily agree that mine needs more dents. That is a sort of condescending statement of opinion as if it were a fact. And honestly, I think for a lot of people, it feels like they're being talked down to. And it doesn't really add much to the discussion or encourage them to listen and take that on board. So I don't know, for me, and I'm not perfect at this, I don't always get this right, I try to say, hey, the entire thing seems to be really beat up, and maybe adding some dents would give you another layer to really help you tell that story even more effectively. Yeah, it takes more time and more energy to think about things on that level and to, type them out effectively, with your thumbs on your phone. And I personally fall guilty of that. I respond and read so many threads and comments on Facebook model making groups that I do, honestly, I get tired. And I may just not feel like saying as much as the person who's posted their work really deserves. And that's on me. I need to just be a little less lazy. And if I don't have time to really offer a really substantive bit of feedback, then, I have to tell myself to, hey, just wait, because it's not that important that it can't wait for me to say it later, if at all. So, anyway, I know this has been pretty rapid fire for the last 17 minutes. I've been actually watching the clock over here. I was hoping I could pop this off in less than 10, but I think it's an important subject. I think critique is valuable. Now, some people just totally disagree. They feel like no critique should ever be given, that if someone puts their work up and puts themselves out there, that no one should ever say anything that smacks of any sort of disagreement with the way that it was done. Hey, that's cool. If that's the way those people want to approach it, that's their business. There are plenty of Facebook groups for model makers that are more casual about things, and that's totally cool. Not all of us are, as obsessed. Not everybody is building for a contest. Not everybody is building for macro photography or magazine articles or whatever. So that's totally cool. And in those groups where critique is explicitly frowned on or banned outright, then, that's their house and those rules should be followed. But for those of us that appreciate that feedback and want that feedback for ourselves and participate in a group like Scale Modelers Critique Group, I think it's important to consider what makes good critique and what separates that from the noise. So hopefully this little bit of rambling will help actually do that. And if you've like, as always, if you've kept up with me for this long and found this interesting and useful, I definitely appreciate you watching. And as always, if you disagree, if you think I'm full of shit, just tell me. Absolutely, I'm not going to react badly to that unless you just say, "Dude, your videos are too long." I already know that. Anyway, thanks for watching. Much love.